The Montana winter of 1889 arrived with unusual ferocity, blanketing the rugged landscape in a silence broken only by the howling winds that swept down from the northern mountains. Thomas Abernathy pulled his coat tighter as the stagecoach rattled along the frozen dirt road, each jolt sending pain through his still-healing ribs. 3 months ago, he'd been a respected detective with the Chicago Police Department. Now he was a man fleeing scandal, his reputation in tatters after a case gone terribly wrong. "Black Creek up ahead, sir," the driver called from above, his voice nearly lost to the whistling wind. Thomas peered through the frost-rimmed window at the scattering of buildings that constituted the town general store. A small church, a saloon, and a dozen or so wooden structures huddled against the vast wilderness. This remote outpost would be his sanctuary, a place where Chicago's newspapers couldn't follow. The stagecoach lurched to a halt before the town's only hotel, a 2-story wooden building with peeling paint. Thomas gathered his meager belongings and stepped down into ankle-deep snow, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "You must be Mr. Abernathy," a voice called. Thomas turned to see a man in his 50s approaching, hand extended. "Sheriff Willis Reed. Got your telegram last week." Thomas shook the offered hand. "Appreciate you meeting me, Sheriff. Not much of a welcoming party, I'm afraid," Reed replied, gesturing to the nearly empty street. "Town's been on edge these past months." "Oh?" Thomas raised an eyebrow, already noting the shuttered windows and quiet storefronts unusual even for a small settlement. Reed's expression darkened. "Whole family vanished from their homestead back in October. The Caldwells, Henry, Martha, and their 4 children. No bodies, no blood, just ... gone. Like they walked away and never came back." Thomas felt a familiar tingle at the base of his skull, the sensation that had led him to both his greatest cases and his ultimate downfall. "Any suspects?" "Nothing concrete," Reed replied, helping Thomas with his bag. "Some say Indians, others blame wolves or bears. Few think they just up and left, though they'd have told someone. Their farm wasn't doing poorly." They trudged through the snow toward the hotel, the wind carrying snippets of hushed conversation from the saloon across the street. "Whole town spooked," Reed continued. "Folks locking doors that haven't seen a key in years. Some packed up and left for the winter." As they reached the hotel porch, Reed paused. "Don't suppose you'd take a look at what we found? I know you came here to escape that detective business, but ... double quotes." Thomas hesitated. The last time he'd followed his instincts, it had cost an innocent man his life. Yet the familiar pull of mystery tugged at him. "Just to look," Thomas replied cautiously. "No promises." Reed nodded, relief evident in his weathered face. "That's all I ask. Get settled in and we'll ride out tomorrow, weather permitting." As Thomas signed the hotel register, he couldn't shake the feeling that Black Creek's mystery might be exactly what he needed, or precisely what would finish breaking him. The Caldwell homestead sat nestled in a small valley 6 miles outside town, surrounded by pine forests that climbed the nearby hills. Thomas and Sheriff Reed approached on horseback the following morning, their breath and that of their mounts creating plumes in the crisp air. The sky above was a clear, harsh blue that seemed to amplify the unnatural stillness of the place. "Nobody's touched anything since we found it empty," Reed explained as they dismounted. "Felt it best to leave things be in case ... quotes, in case the family returned," Thomas thought, though they both knew that after nearly 2 months such hopes were fanciful at best. The homestead consisted of a main cabin, a barn, and a small chicken coop. All structures remained intact, no signs of fire, collapse, or violence. Thomas approached the cabin cautiously, his police instincts resurging despite his best efforts to suppress them. "Door was unlocked when we found it," Reed offered, following close behind. Thomas pushed the door open. The hinges creaked in protest, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet valley. Inside, the cabin was cold but orderly. A table with 6 chairs stood in the center, plates and cups still set as if for a meal. A pot hung over the cold hearth, its contents long since frozen and spoiled. "It's like they were about to eat," Reed whispered. Thomas nodded, noting the fine layer of dust that had settled over everything. He moved methodically through the small cabin, 2 bedrooms, one for the parents and one where all 4 children apparently slept, judging by the pallets on the floor. Clothes hung on pegs, personal items sat on shelves, and a family Bible lay open on a small side table. "They didn't pack anything," Thomas observed. "No signs of struggle either. Outside, they checked the barn next. The family's 2 horses and cow were gone, but their tack remained hanging on the wall. The chicken coop was empty as well, though with the door left open, the fowl could have simply wandered off or been taken by predators." "What do you make of it?" Reed asked as they stood in the yard surveying the property. Thomas frowned, turning slowly to take in the surrounding forest. "I'm not sure yet. There's no blood, no signs of violence or forced entry. If they left willingly, why leave everything behind? And if they were taken against their will, where's the evidence of struggle? That's what's got everyone spooked, Reed replied. It's like they just vanished into thin air. Thomas's gaze fell upon something partially buried in the snow near the edge of the yard, a child's doll with a porcelain face, one arm missing. He picked it up, brushing away the frost. One of the Caldwell girls, Emily, age 7, was rarely without this, according to neighbors, Reed explained. Found it right there, like it was dropped. Thomas examined the doll closely, noting that apart from exposure to the elements, it seemed undamaged. He placed it carefully in his coat pocket. Sheriff, is there anyone who might have wanted the Caldwells gone? Any disputes over land, business matters, personal grudges? Reed shrugged. Henry kept to himself mostly. Came out here from Pennsylvania 3 years ago. Martha taught at the school in town occasionally. Children were well behaved. Nothing unusual. Thomas nodded, his mind already cataloging possibilities and inconsistencies. I'd like to speak with their neighbors, anyone who saw them last. As they mounted their horses to leave, Thomas cast one final glance at the abandoned homestead. The rational part of him knew there must be a logical explanation, yet he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that they were being watched from the surrounding forest. The Black Creek saloon buzzed with hushed conversations that fell silent as Thomas and Sheriff Reed entered. Thomas felt the weight of suspicious gazes as they made their way to the bar, the floorboards creaking beneath their boots. "Evening, gentlemen," the barkeep acknowledged, his eyes lingering on Thomas. "You must be the fellow from Chicago, Thomas Abernathy," he confirmed, ordering whiskey for himself and Reed. "Word travels fast." "Not much else to talk about these days," the man replied, sliding their drinks across the scarred wooden surface. He introduced himself as Emmett Parker, owner of both the saloon and the general store next door. "Mr. Parker," Thomas began, keeping his voice low, "I understand you knew the Caldwell family." Parker's hands paused in their work of wiping a glass. "As well as anyone, I suppose. Good customers, paid their debts on time." "When did you last see them?" "Henry came in for supplies on October 12th. Nothing unusual, flour, coffee, ammunition for his rifle. Said winter was coming early this year." Parker shook his head. "Never thought that'd be the last time I'd see him." Thomas sipped his whiskey, welcoming the burning sensation. "Did he mention any plans? Any concerns?" "Nothing out of the ordinary," Parker replied. "Though," Thomas leaned forward slightly. "Though," Parker glanced around before continuing. "Martha came in alone the week before, bought more supplies than usual. When I commented on it, she just said they were preparing. Didn't say for what." From a corner table, a gruff voice interrupted. "Tell him about the stranger, Emmett." Thomas turned to see an elderly man with a wild gray beard watching them intently. "That's just Jacob's imagination," Parker dismissed with a wave of his hand. Sheriff Reed sighed. Jacob Finch, town's oldest resident and most enthusiastic storyteller. The old man rose unsteadily and approached their group. "Ain't no story. 2 weeks before the Caldwells vanished, a stranger passed through. Fancy clothes, city manner, asking questions about homesteads in the area. His rheumy eyes fixed on Thomas. Specifically asked about the valley where the Caldwells lived." Thomas exchanged a glance with Reed. "Did you report this to the sheriff?" "Of course I did," Jacob huffed. "But by then the man was long gone." Reed nodded reluctantly. "We looked into it. Nobody else remembered such a visitor. And Jacob's eyesight isn't what it used to be. I know what I saw," Jacob insisted before shuffling back to his table, muttering under his breath. As the evening progressed, Thomas spoke with other townspeople, collecting fragments of information about the Caldwells. Their children, 2 boys and 2 girls aged 4 to 11, attended the small schoolhouse when weather permitted. Henry occasionally worked as a hunting guide for wealthy Easterners seeking trophies. Martha was known for her herbal remedies and midwifery skills. One conversation particularly caught Thomas's attention. Sarah Wilson, the schoolteacher, pulled him aside as he was leaving. The oldest boy, James, was acting strange before they disappeared, she whispered. "Jumpy. Drawing disturbing pictures." When I asked what was wrong, he said they were being watched. "Watched by whom?" Thomas asked. He wouldn't say. Just kept drawing the same thing. A tall figure at the edge of their property, half hidden by trees. She hesitated. "I thought it was just a child's imagination. Now I wondered, double quotes later." In his hotel room, Thomas spread out the notes he'd taken throughout the day, attempting to organize the fragments into a coherent narrative. Outside, the wind howled around the building's corners, and snow tapped against his window like phantom fingers seeking entry. The facts remained frustratingly sparse. Family of 6 vanished without obvious struggle. A homestead left intact. Horses and livestock missing. a child who felt watched, a stranger who may or may not have existed. Thomas rubbed his tired eyes, the old familiar obsession beginning to take hold. Despite his determination to leave detective work behind, he found himself unable to let go of the mystery. He removed the porcelain doll from his pocket and placed it on the bedside table, its painted eyes seeming to follow him in the flickering lamplight. Sleep came reluctantly that night, and when it did, Thomas dreamed of 6 empty chairs around a table and something watching from the forest's edge. Thomas awoke before dawn, his mind still churning with questions from the previous day's investigation. The hotel room was frigid, the fire in the small stove having died during the night. As he rekindled the flames, he noticed something he'd overlooked before, a small trunk tucked beneath his bed, likely left by a previous occupant. Curiosity piqued, he pulled it out. The lock had long since been broken, and inside he found nothing but old newspapers and a leather-bound ledger. The ledger caught his attention immediately. Opening it, he discovered it was a journal belonging to Dr. Samuel Wilson. Sarah, Wilson's father and the town's physician until his death last spring. Thomas flipped through the pages, scanning entries dating back several years. Most documented mundane medical matters, cases of influenza, broken bones, births, and deaths. But entries from last summer regarding the Caldwell family gave him pause. July 18, 1889, visited Caldwell Homestead. Martha reports youngest boy Michael Fors, suffering nightmares, refuses to sleep alone. Claims to see the tall man watching through windows at night. Prescribed mild sedative. August 3, 1889. Henry Caldwell came to office, concerned about Martha's behavior. Says she's become obsessed with protecting the children from something she won't name. Appears rational otherwise. September 12, 1889. All 4 Caldwell children now reporting nightmares and strange sightings near property. Parents showing signs of acute anxiety. No physical ailments detected. Recommended they consider returning east for winter. Thomas closed the journal, troubled by its implications. The timeline aligned with what he'd gathered. Months of escalating fear before the family's disappearance in October. But fear of what? Quit. He dressed quickly and made his way to the sheriff's office, finding Reed already at his desk despite the early hour. Found something interesting, Thomas began, placing the journal before Reed. Dr. Wilson's medical records. Seems the Caldwells were troubled by something for months before they vanished. Reed frowned as he read the entries. Sarah never mentioned this to me. Perhaps she didn't know, Thomas suggested. Doctor-patient confidentiality. But this changes things. Whatever happened to the Caldwells likely began long before October. Reed looked up, his expression grim. There's something you should see too. He pulled a folder from his desk drawer. Telegram came yesterday from the marshal's office in Helena. I asked them to check if similar cases had occurred elsewhere. Thomas opened the folder, discovering reports of 3 other homesteading families who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. One in Wyoming in 1886, another in Dakota Territory in 1887, and a third in northern Montana earlier in 1889. None had ever been found. All families with young children, Thomas noted. All in remote locations. All vanished without signs of violence. And all had reported being watched or followed in the months before their disappearances, Reed added quietly. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. We need to speak with Sarah Wilson again. And I want to revisit the Caldwell property. There must be something we missed. As they prepared to leave, the door burst open, admitting a snow-covered Emmett Parker. "Sheriff," he gasped, breathless from running. "Jacob Finch is dead." Thomas and Reed exchanged alarmed glances. "What happened?" Reed demanded. "Found him in his cabin this morning." Door was open, snow all over the floor. Parker shuddered. He was sitting in his chair, just staring. "Doctor says his heart gave out, but double quotes, but what?" Thomas prompted. "His face, Mr. Abernathy." I'd never seen such terror on a man's face before. And there was something clutched in his hand. Parker held out a crumpled piece of paper. "It's a drawing. Looks like a child made it." Thomas unfolded the paper carefully. On it was a crude charcoal sketch of a tall, unnaturally thin figure standing among trees. The figure had no distinct features, just a blank oval where a face should be. At the bottom, in childish handwriting, "He comes for families." "That's James Caldwell's drawing," Reed whispered. "The one Sarah mentioned. But how did Jacob get it?" Thomas studied the drawing, a terrible suspicion forming in his mind. Jacob said he saw a stranger asking about the Caldwell property. What if he knew more than he told us? The implications hung heavy in the small office. Outside, the wind picked up, driving snow against the windows like countless tiny fists demanding entry. The cemetery of Black Creek sat on a small hill overlooking the town, its iron gates half buried in snowdrifts as Thomas and Sheriff Reed approached. They had come directly from Jacob Finch's cabin, where the old man's body had already been removed. But the atmosphere of dread remained, windows frosted over as if the very glass feared what it might witness. Floors bearing the tracks of multiple sets of boots, despite Parker's insistence he'd found Jacob alone. "You really think this is necessary?" Reed asked as Thomas pushed open the creaking cemetery gate. "6 people vanished without a trace," Thomas replied, his breath visible in the cold air. "A man dies of fright clutching a child's drawing. Yes, I think checking recent burials is warranted." The graveyard was small, befitting a town of Black Creek's size. Thomas moved methodically among the headstones, noting names and dates. Near the back he found what he was looking for, a section of relatively fresh graves. The earth still slightly mounded despite the snow cover. 4 graves from last summer, he observed, brushing snow from one marker. "All children." Reed nodded solemnly. "Diphtheria outbreak. Terrible business." Thomas moved to another section, where several more recent graves stood. "And these? Mining accident in September. Shaft collapsed about 15 miles north." Reed pointed to individual markers. "These 3 were local men." Thomas frowned, counting the graves. "There are 5 fresh plots here, not 3. Reed's brow furrowed as he counted. "That can't be right. Only Peterson, Miller, and Harding died in that collapse." Thomas knelt beside the unmarked graves, brushing away snow to reveal freshly turned earth beneath. No headstones. "When did you last visit the cemetery, Sheriff?" "Not since the miner's funeral," Reed admitted. "Been too busy with the Caldwell matter." Thomas began digging at one of the unmarked graves with his gloved hands, and after a moment of hesitation, Reed joined him. 6 inches down, they found not a coffin, but a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Thomas unwrapped it carefully to reveal a child's clothing, a small dress, shoes, undergarments. "These look like they'd fit the Caldwell's youngest girl," Reed whispered. They moved to the second unmarked grave and found similar contents. Boy's clothing, approximately sized for a 10-year-old, along with a small wooden toy horse that Reed identified as belonging to the Caldwell's eldest son. "Someone buried their belongings, not their bodies," Thomas said quietly, as if performing a funeral without corpses. "But who? And why?" Reed's voice had taken on an edge of genuine fear. Thomas stood, brushing soil from his hands. "I think it's time we had another conversation with Sarah Wilson. They found the schoolteacher at her small house adjoining the schoolroom." Her face paled visibly when Thomas placed the recovered clothing on her table. "You know something about the Caldwells," Thomas stated. "Not a question, but an accusation. Your father's journal details their fears in the months before they vanished. Now we find their children's belongings buried in unmarked graves." Sarah's hands trembled as she sat heavily in a chair. "I didn't think anyone would believe me." "Try us," Reed said gently. She took a deep breath. "It's happened before. Not just here, but in other settlements. My father was documenting the cases. Families who reported being watched. Children with nightmares. Then ... disappearances. The other cases the marshal's office found," Thomas confirmed. Sarah nodded. "My father believes something was taking these families. Something that fixates on children first, then the entire household. Taking them where?" Reed pressed. "He never discovered that." Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "But he found patterns. It always begins with the children feeling watched. Then the sightings begin, a tall figure at the edge of the property. Then they vanish, always on the night of a new moon." Thomas felt his skin prickle. "Tonight is a new moon." Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I buried their clothes. It's an old ritual. My grandmother taught it to my father. She said it appeases whatever takes them, stops it from coming for more." "Why didn't you tell us this before?" Reed demanded. "Would you have believed me? That some ... thing is stealing entire families? You would have thought me mad." Her eyes met Thomas's. Jacob Finch knew. He'd seen it happen in another settlement years ago. That's why he recognized the stranger in town, not a man at all, but something wearing the appearance of one. The room fell silent save for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Outside, the afternoon light was already beginning to fade, the short winter day drawing to a close. "I need to see your father's research," Thomas said finally. "All of it." As Sarah rose to retrieve the requested materials, Thomas moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening forest beyond the town limits. For the first time since arriving in Black Creek, he felt a sensation he hadn't experienced since his last case in Chicago, absolute certainty that he was confronting something beyond his understanding, something that defied rational explanation. And somewhere in those woods, he sensed, it was waiting for night to fall. Dr. Samuel Wilson's study remained untouched since his death, a shrine to the man's obsessive documentation. Thomas, Reed, and Sarah stood surrounded by stacks of books. medical journals and handwritten notes that covered every available surface. Outside, the last light of day was fading rapidly, shadows lengthening across the snow-covered ground. Father became obsessed after the first case he encountered in Dakota, Sarah explained, pulling a worn leather journal from a drawer. This contains everything he learned. Thomas opened the journal carefully, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting, sketches, and newspaper clippings. Dr. Wilson had documented 17 cases spanning nearly 3 decades, all following the same pattern. Families in isolated areas, children reporting being watched, and eventual disappearances without trace, always during a new moon. He called it the Harvester, Sarah said quietly. Thomas turned a page to find a detailed sketch similar to the one Jacob Finch had clutched, a tall, thin figure with elongated limbs and a featureless face. Alongside it, Wilson had written observations from various witnesses. It appears differently to each observer, Thomas read aloud, though always maintaining an unnatural height and thinness. Some report a man in formal attire, others a figure composed of shadow. Children most commonly describe it as having no face, merely a smooth surface where features should exist. Reed peered over Thomas's shoulder. This is madness. You can't possibly believe. I believe the Caldwells are gone, Thomas interrupted. I believe Jacob Finch died of terror with this same image clutched in his hand. Beyond that, I'm reserving judgment. He continued reading, finding Wilson's theories about the entity's nature. The doctor had concluded it was neither human nor animal, but something that existed in the spaces between settled lands, something ancient that had adapted to human expansion into the wilderness. It does not kill, Thomas read with growing unease, but collects. Families vanish intact, with no evidence of violence. In 3 documented cases, witnesses reported seeing the missing families days or weeks later, walking into the forest at night. When followed, no trace could be found. It is as if they become part of its collection, neither alive nor dead, but preserved in some state between. A particularly disturbing passage caught Thomas's attention. The entity appears unable to enter homes unless invited, but can influence the minds of children through windows or any opening. Once a child acknowledges its presence, it gains partial entry to the household. Full invitation typically occurs unwittingly, a door left open, a window unlatched. Reports suggest it can mimic familiar voices to lure family members outside. Sarah touched the page with trembling fingers. The last entry from October. He knew the Caldwells were at risk. Thomas turned to the final pages, finding increasingly frantic notes. Wilson had attempted to warn the Caldwells, but Henry had dismissed his concerns as superstition. The doctor's final entry, dated October 14th, simply read, "Too late. The children reported seeing it inside the house last night. I fear for them when the new moon comes." October 15th was a new moon, Reed whispered, the day they vanished. Thomas closed the journal, his mind racing. If there's any truth to this, and I'm not saying there is, then Wilson believed this entity operates on predictable patterns. It selects a family, gradually gains access through the children, and takes them during a new moon, which is tonight, Sarah reminded them, her voice tight with fear. Reed scoffed, though his expression betrayed his unease. This is absurd. We're talking about fairy tales and campfire stories. There has to be a rational explanation. Perhaps, Thomas conceded. But rational or not, something happened to the Caldwells, and to those other families. And according to these records, there's a pattern of multiple disappearances in the same region. Sarah's face went ashen. You think it's still here, looking for another family? Before Thomas could respond, the door to the study burst open, admitting Emmett Parker and a young woman clutching a small child to her chest. Sheriff Parker gasped. The Mitchell boy, he's been seeing things at the edge of their property. The woman, Mrs. Mitchell, stepped forward, her face streaked with tears. It started 3 days ago. He says there's a tall man watching from the trees. This morning I found the back door wide open, though I know I locked it last night. Thomas and Reed exchanged glances. Coincidence or confirmation, the timing was uncanny. How old is your son, Mrs. Mitchell? Thomas asked quietly. 6, she replied, clutching the boy tighter. My husband's away cutting timber until tomorrow. Please. I don't know what's happening, but I'm frightened. Thomas made a swift decision. Sheriff, gather as many men as you can. Mrs. Mitchell, you and your son will stay here in town tonight where people can watch over you. He turned to Parker. I need lamps, rope, and volunteers willing to keep watch at the Mitchell property tonight. What exactly are we watching for? Parker asked. Thomas hesitated, unwilling to voice the impossible suspicions forming in his mind. Let's just say I want to confirm or disprove a theory. Either way, no one should be alone at that house tonight. As the others left to make preparations, Reed pulled Thomas aside. "You don't really believe Wilson's fairy tale, do you?" Thomas gazed out the window at the gathering darkness, remembering the terrible stillness of the Caldwell homestead, the doll abandoned in the snow, and the look of absolute terror on Jacob Finch's dead face. "What I believe," he said carefully, "is that something happened to those families. And if there's even a slight chance we can prevent it from happening again, we have to try." The wall clock struck 5, and with the early winter nightfall, the room was already cast in deep shadows. Thomas lit a lamp, its warm glow pushing back the darkness but doing little to dispel the growing sense of dread that had settled over the group. "Tonight we get answers," he said, as much to reassure himself as the others. "One way or another." The Mitchell homestead stood a mile and a half from town, a modest cabin surrounded by a clearing hacked from the encroaching forest. By 7 o'clock, Thomas had organized a perimeter of men around the property. Sheriff Reed at the front door, Parker and 3 volunteers positioned at strategic points, all armed and equipped with oil lamps. Thomas himself took position at the rear of the cabin, his back to the wall, facing the dark line of trees 30 yards away. The night was eerily still, the usual sounds of the forest owls, rustling creatures, conspicuously absent. Above, the sky was clear and star-filled, the absence of moonlight creating a perfect darkness beneath the tree canopy. "This is foolishness," one of the volunteers, a blacksmith named Harris, muttered from his position nearby. "Standing out in the cold because of some ghost story." Thomas made no reply. His years as a detective had taught him to trust patterns and evidence, even when they pointed toward improbable conclusions. 6 people had vanished without trace. A man had died of fright. A child reported the same entity that 17 other families had described before disappearing. Coincidence seemed increasingly unlikely. The hours passed with excruciating slowness. At 10 o'clock, Thomas made a circuit of the perimeter, checking on each man, finding them cold but alert. At midnight, Reed joined him at his position. "Nothing," the sheriff reported. "Not so much as a coyote." Thomas nodded, his eyes never leaving the tree line. "Maybe I was wrong." Reed stamped his feet against the cold. "Or maybe whatever happened to the Caldwells was human after all. Could be they ran afoul of outlaws or hostile Indians. Without signs of struggle? With reports of being watched for months beforehand?" Thomas shook his head. "And what about the other cases Wilson documented?" Reed had no answer for that. He returned to his post, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts in the impenetrable darkness beyond his lamplight. At 2 in the morning, Thomas noticed something odd, a section of forest that seemed darker than its surroundings, as if the starlight couldn't penetrate it. He narrowed his eyes, trying to make sense of the anomaly, when a movement caught his attention. Something tall and thin detached itself from the darkness between 2 pines. It stood motionless at the edge of the clearing, a silhouette that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the dim light. Thomas felt his heart hammer against his ribs as he raised his lamp higher, trying to illuminate the figure. "Reed," he called, his voice unexpectedly hoarse. "Harris, something at the southwest corner." The figure didn't react to his shout. It simply stood, unnaturally still, its proportions subtly wrong, limbs too long, head too small for its height. Thomas found his hand moving instinctively to his revolver, though some deep instinct told him bullets would be useless against whatever watched from the forest's edge. Reed arrived at his side, rifle raised. "Where?" Thomas pointed, but as Reed's lamplight joined his own, the figure was no longer there. It was just there, Thomas insisted, hearing the weakness of his words even as he spoke them. Reed scanned the tree line skeptically. "Maybe a deer? Or your eyes playing tricks after hours in the cold?" Before Thomas could respond, a shout came from the far side of the property. They rushed toward it, finding Harris wide-eyed and pointing into the forest. "I saw it," the blacksmith stammered, all earlier skepticism gone from his voice. "A man, but not a man, too tall, too thin. It just stood there watching, then stepped back into the trees and vanished." The 3 men stood silent, their lamps creating a small island of light in the vast darkness. Thomas felt a certainty settling over him like a shroud. They were being toyed with, assessed. "Back to positions," he ordered quietly. "No one stands alone. For the next hour." Sightings continued, the figure appearing briefly at different points along the tree line, never approaching, never remaining long enough for a clear view. The men grew increasingly agitated, some wanting to pursue the intruder into the forest, others suggesting retreat to town. "We hold our positions," Thomas insisted. "That's what it wants, to separate us, to lure us into the trees." At 4 in the morning, with dawn still hours away, an unnatural silence fell. Even the wind died completely, leaving the clearing in perfect stillness. Thomas felt the hairs on his neck rise seconds before Parker's shout cut through the quiet. "The house, it's at the house." Thomas and Reed raced toward the cabin's front door, where Parker stood frozen, lamp raised toward the structure. Thomas followed his gaze upward and felt his blood turn to ice. A figure crouched on the cabin's roof, impossibly thin, limbs bent at unnatural angles. In the lamplight, Thomas caught a glimpse of what might have been a face, smooth and white like porcelain, before the thing skittered with inhuman speed down the far side of the roof and vanished. "Inside," Thomas commanded, rushing for the door. "Check every room." The cabin was as they had left it, empty, cold, undisturbed. Yet something had changed. A presence lingered, an almost tangible malevolence that made the air feel thick and difficult to breathe. "The Mitchell boy said it watches through windows," Reed whispered. "What if it can mark a house somehow? Tag it for later like a hunter marks prey." Thomas had no answer, but Wilson's journal entries flashed through his mind, the progression from observation to infiltration to disappearance. If the pattern held true, the Mitchells would have been in grave danger had they remained. "We stay until dawn," Thomas decided. All of us together, inside. The men gathered in the cabin's main room, lamps burning bright, weapons at the ready. None spoke of what they had seen, as if giving voice to it might somehow make the entity stronger. Thomas moved to a window, peering out at the forest that now seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. In his mind he heard the echo of Sarah Wilson's words. "It collects, not kills, but collects." The distinction haunted him as he kept his vigil, waiting for the first light of dawn to break the power of the moonless night. First light arrived with agonizing slowness, the eastern sky gradually shifting from black to deep blue to the pale gray of winter dawn. The men remained tense until true sunlight breached the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-covered clearing. Only then did Thomas allow himself to relax marginally, the night's accumulated tension leaving his shoulders in an almost painful release. "We made it," Parker whispered, voicing what they all felt, a mixture of relief and disbelief. Thomas nodded, though his mind was already turning over the night's events, trying to fit them into a coherent pattern. "Let's check the perimeter in daylight." The men spread out, searching the property with renewed confidence now that darkness had retreated. Thomas focused on the area where they had seen the figure on the roof, examining the snow beneath for any signs of footprints or disturbance. "Abernathy," Reed called from the tree line. "You need to see this." Thomas found the sheriff standing at the forest's edge, staring at something in the snow. As he approached, he saw what had captured Reed's attention, a set of tracks leading from the trees toward the cabin, then circling the structure before returning to the forest. "Those aren't human tracks," Harris observed, his voice hushed. Thomas knelt to examine them more closely. The impressions resembled footprints, but were elongated and narrow, with what appeared to be only 3 toe marks at the front. More disturbing was the depth despite the creature's apparent height and probable weight. The prints barely compressed the snow, as if whatever made them was unnaturally light. "They lead north," Thomas noted, following their direction into the trees, toward the Caldwell property. The men exchanged glances, their earlier relief evaporating in the face of this tangible evidence. "We follow them," Thomas decided, straightening up, at least far enough to confirm where they lead. Reed looked dubious. "In broad daylight, maybe, but we should get more men from town first." Thomas shook his head. "Snow's already starting to melt in the sun. These tracks will be gone in hours." After a brief debate, 3 volunteers elected to return to town, while Thomas, Reed, Parker, and Harris prepared to follow the trail. They took only essential supplies, weapons, water, a small amount of food, and a compass. Thomas insisted they maintain visual contact with each other at all times. The tracks led them along a winding path through the forest, not following any obvious trail, but moving with deliberate purpose. After an hour of careful progress, Thomas began to recognize landmarks from his previous visit to the area. "We're headed directly for the Caldwell homestead," he confirmed, checking his compass. They proceeded with increasing caution, the midday sun providing light but little warmth in the winter forest. Around noon, they emerged from the trees within sight of the Caldwell cabin, standing undisturbed just as they had left it days earlier. "Tracks lead right up to it," Reed observed. Indeed, the strange footprints approached the cabin directly, circled it once, then continued past toward a ridge beyond the property. "We keep following," Thomas insisted, though he noted the growing unease among his companions. Beyond the ridge, the landscape changed, the open valley giving way to increasingly rough terrain, with rocky outcroppings and denser forest. The tracks remained clear, leading them deeper into wilderness rarely visited even by local hunters. "Must be 3 miles from the Caldwell place now," Parker commented as they navigated a steep ravine. "How much further do we go?" Thomas was about to respond when he noticed the tracks abruptly change direction, heading straight toward a sheer rock face about 100 yards ahead. Just to those rocks, he decided. Then we'll reassess. As they approached the cliff, an opening became visible, a narrow fissure in the rock face, barely wide enough for a man to pass through sideways. The strange tracks led directly into this dark aperture. "It's a cave," Reed said unnecessarily, raising his lantern toward the opening. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. "The tracks only go in," he observed quietly. "None coming out." The men stood in silence, staring at the dark fissure. Even in daylight, the opening seemed to swallow all illumination, a void cut into the mountainside. "We need more men," Reed decided. "Torches, proper equipment." "We're not prepared for cave exploration," Thomas nodded reluctantly, knowing the sheriff was right. "We'll mark the location and return tomorrow with reinforcements." As they prepared to head back, Thomas noticed something partially buried in the snow near the cave entrance, a small object that caught the sunlight. Brushing away the powder, he uncovered a child's shoe, sized for a girl of perhaps 7 or 8 years. Though weathered by exposure, it was unmistakably similar to the clothing they had found buried in the unmarked grave. Emily Caldwell's, Reed confirmed after examining it. Same size and style as the ones in town. Thomas placed the shoe carefully, his coat pocket alongside the porcelain doll he had found days earlier. The evidence was mounting, pointing toward a conclusion he still struggled to accept, that something not entirely human had taken the Caldwells, and perhaps many others before them. "Tomorrow," he promised quietly, casting one last glance at the dark cave entrance. "We'll come back with enough men to search thoroughly," as they turned to retrace their steps. Thomas couldn't shake the sensation of being watched from the darkness behind them, a patient, ancient gaze that had witnessed countless winters and would endure countless more. The expedition assembled before dawn the next morning, 12 men including Thomas, Reed, Parker, and several miners experienced in underground work. They carried proper equipment this time: sturdy lanterns, rope, provisions, and weapons. The mood was somber, determination mingled with undisguised fear after Thomas and Reed had shared their findings. "Remember," Thomas addressed the group as they prepared to depart, "we stay together. No one separates under any circumstances. Our objective is to determine if the Caldwells might be inside. Okay, then return to town for further assistance if necessary." They reached the cave entrance by mid-morning, the strange tracks from yesterday already fading but still visible in the patchy snow. The fissure looked even more forbidding in the clear winter light, a dark slash against the gray rock face emanating a palpable chill. 2 miners went first, experienced in navigating tight spaces. They reported the passage widened after about 20 feet, opening into a larger cavern. One by one, the men squeezed through the narrow entrance, lanterns held high to push back the absolute darkness. The main chamber was surprisingly large, its ceiling lost in shadows beyond their lamplight. The air felt dense and stagnant, carrying a faint, musty scent like old cloth and something else, a sweet, sour odor that Thomas couldn't immediately identify but found deeply unsettling. "Look there," Parker whispered, pointing his lamp toward the chamber's floor. The ground was marked with countless tracks like those they had followed, overlapping, moving in various directions, some fresher than others. The implication was clear: whatever made these prints used this cave regularly and had done so for some time. 3 tunnels leading deeper, one of the miners reported after a quick survey. "Which do we take?" Thomas examined the ground carefully, noting that the freshest tracks led toward the rightmost passage. "This way," he decided, "and stay close." The tunnel descended at a gentle angle, its walls smooth as if worn by water or constant use. After several hundred yards, it opened into a second chamber. Smaller than the first, but with a disturbing new feature: crude shelves had been carved into the rock walls, and upon these shelves sat objects. "Personal effects," Reed breathed, raising his lamp to illuminate the macabre collection. "My God." Hundreds of items lined the shelves: children's toys, clothing, jewelry, tools, books, family Bibles, all arranged with methodical precision. Thomas recognized a hand-carved pipe that matched the description of Henry Caldwell's prized possession. Nearby sat a woman's hairbrush with strands of dark hair still caught in the bristles. "They're trophies," Parker suggested, his voice barely audible. Thomas moved deeper into the chamber, examining the collection. Some items appeared decades old, their materials degraded by time and the cave's dampness. Others looked relatively new, including a child's slate with math problems still chalked upon its surface. "This goes back years," Thomas observed. "Generations, maybe." Reed lifted a tarnished pocket watch from a shelf. "This has an inscription: to John Wheeler, from your loving wife, 1852. That's nearly 40 years ago." The implications settled over the group like a shroud. Whatever inhabited this cave had been collecting from families for far longer than any of them had previously imagined. "There's another passage," one of the miners called from across the chamber. "Sounds like running water ahead." They proceeded with increasing caution, the tunnel narrowing again before opening into the largest chamber yet. A small underground stream cut across the floor, disappearing into a crevice at the far side. But it wasn't the water that stopped the men in their tracks, it was what stood arranged. Around the chamber's perimeter, structures resembling crude nests or cocoons lined the walls, each approximately the size of a human body, composed of twisted branches, cloth, mud, and some unidentifiable fibrous material. They stood upright against the rock, their surfaces glistening wetly in the lamplight. 6 of them, Reed counted, his voice cracking. Recent ones, anyway. Thomas approached the nearest cocoon cautiously, lamp extended. The surface moved slightly as if responding to the heat of the flame. With mounting horror, he realized the material was organic, not quite plant matter, not quite animal, but something in between. Like living tissue grown to serve as a protective shell. "Is someone in there?" Parker asked, revulsion evident in his voice. Thomas found himself unable to answer, his rational mind rebelling against what his instincts were telling him. He raised a hand to touch the surface of the nearest cocoon, then jerked back as the material pulsed beneath his fingers, warm and unmistakably alive. "We need to open one," he said finally. "We need to know." Using a knife, Thomas carefully cut into the fibrous shell of the smallest cocoon sized for a child. The material parted with disturbing ease, releasing a cloud of sweet-sour vapor that made the men recoil. Thomas steeled himself and widened the opening, raising his lamp to see inside. The interior was lined with a clear, gelatinous substance that seemed to glow faintly from within, and suspended in this medium was the unmistakable form of a young girl, Emily Caldwell. Still wearing the same dress she had disappeared in months ago, her eyes closed as if in peaceful sleep. "Is she?" Reed couldn't finish the question. Thomas reached in cautiously, touching the girl's hand. It was warm, and as his fingers made contact, her eyelids fluttered briefly. "She's alive," he whispered incredulously. They all might be. The men moved with renewed urgency, cutting open the remaining cocoons to reveal the rest of the Caldwell family, all alive, all suspended in the same strange stasis. None showed awareness of their surroundings, their breathing shallow but regular, pulses slow but steady. "We need to get them out," Thomas decided. Now, as they prepared to remove the family from their organic prisons, a sound echoed from the tunnel behind them, a soft scraping, like something large dragging itself along the stone floor. The men froze, lanterns raised toward the passage. "It's coming back," Parker whispered, voicing what they all feared. Thomas made a swift decision. "Half of you start getting the family out. The rest form a defensive line." He checked his revolver, knowing instinctively that bullets might slow but not stop whatever approached. We came prepared this time. The scraping grew louder, accompanied by a rhythmic clicking that reminded Thomas of insects. He positioned himself at the front of the group, lamp held high in one hand, weapon in the other, his heart pounding against his ribs as darkness seemed to coalesce at the tunnel's mouth. Whatever had been collecting families for generations was about to face those who had uncovered its lair, and Thomas knew with grim certainty that it would not surrender its collection without a fight. The thing that emerged from the tunnel defied easy description. In the wavering lamplight, it appeared as a tall, emaciated humanoid figure with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its skin, if it could be called that, was a pallid gray that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. But it was the face, or lack thereof, that struck terror into the men's hearts. A smooth, featureless oval with subtle indentations where eyes should have been. It paused at the chamber entrance, those eyeless depressions somehow conveying the sensation of a predator assessing prey. No one moved, the only sound the soft splashing of the underground stream and the ragged breathing of terrified men. Thomas found his voice first. "Get the family out," he commanded quietly to those behind him. Now the creature's head tilted at the sound of his voice, and it took a tentative step forward, movements fluid yet wrong, like a puppet controlled by an unskilled hand. Thomas raised his revolver, though some primitive instinct told him bullets would be ineffective against whatever stood before them. "Stay back," he warned, knowing the futility of reasoning with it, but driven by human instinct to try. The creature paused again, head cocking to the other side as if considering his words. Then, with speed that belied its awkward appearance, it launched itself toward the men. Gunshots echoed deafeningly in the confined space as Thomas and Reed fired simultaneously. The creature jerked as bullets struck it, dark viscous fluid spraying from the impacts, but it didn't fall. Instead, it seemed to ripple, its form momentarily destabilizing before re-solidifying as it continued its advance. The lanterns, Thomas shouted, remembering Wilson's notes about the entity avoiding light. Surrounded with light, the men rushed forward with their lamps forming a circle around the creature. It recoiled from the flames, emitting a high, keening sound that seemed to vibrate through their bones rather than reach their ears through air. The strategy worked momentarily, keeping it at bay while others worked frantically to extract the Caldwell family from their organic prisons. "They're all free," Parker called from behind. "But they won't wake up." Thomas risked a glance backward, seeing the 6 Caldwells laid carefully on the stone floor, still unconscious but breathing. "Get them out one at a time. We'll hold it here." The creature seemed to understand their intentions. It moved with renewed purpose, elongated arms lashing out to knock lamps from the men's hands. 2 miners fell back, crying out as the entity's touch left burning welts on their skin. The defensive circle weakened and the creature pressed its advantage. In desperation, Thomas grabbed a flask of lamp oil from his pack, dousing the ground between them and the entity. "Fire!" he shouted, striking a match and dropping it onto the oil. Flames erupted in a whooshing line, forcing the creature back with a shriek that made the men's ears bleed. Taking advantage of the momentary reprieve, they began the difficult process of retreating while carrying the unconscious Caldwells. "It's not just light," Reed observed as they backed toward the tunnel. "It's fire, specifically. It fears burning." The retreat became a nightmarish ordeal, moving backward through narrow tunnels while carrying limp bodies, constantly watching for signs of pursuit. The creature kept its distance but followed persistently, sometimes visible in the darkness beyond their lamplight, sometimes just a feeling of malevolent presence at their backs. In the original entrance chamber, they paused to catch their breath and organize their final exit through the narrow fissure. "We'll have to pass them through one by one," Thomas decided. "Reed, Parker, you 2 go first and help from outside. The rest of us will send the family through, then follow." As they prepared to implement this plan, Thomas noticed something disturbing. The unconscious Caldwell's skin had begun to take on a grayish pallor similar to the creature's. More alarming still, the youngest boy's fingers had elongated slightly, the joints becoming more pronounced. "They're changing," he whispered to Reed. "We need to get them into sunlight immediately." The process of squeezing 6 unconscious bodies through the narrow entrance was agonizingly slow. Throughout, Thomas maintained a vigilant watch on the tunnels, aware of the creature's presence just beyond the reach of their lamps. It seemed to be waiting, patient in a way that suggested centuries of existence, confident in its ability to outlast the human interlopers. As the last Caldwell child was passed through to safety, the miners began making their own escape. Thomas insisted on being last, maintaining their defensive position until everyone else had reached the surface. Just as he prepared to enter the fissure himself, movement caught his eye, not from the tunnels but from the ceiling. He raised his lamp to see the creature clinging spider-like to the rock above, having circled behind them through some unknown passage. Before Thomas could shout a warning, it dropped, landing between him and the exit. In the confined space, there was nowhere to retreat. Acting on instinct, Thomas hurled his lamp directly at the entity, shattering the glass and dousing it in burning oil. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The creature erupted in blue-white flames, its form contorting in ways that defied anatomical possibility. A psychic scream tore through Thomas's mind, bringing him to his knees as the burning entity thrashed wildly about the chamber. "Abernathy?" Reed's voice called from the fissure. "Come on." Disoriented and half-blind from pain, Thomas crawled toward the sound, feeling hands grab his shoulders and drag him through the narrow opening. He emerged into blinding daylight, gasping for fresh air, his mind still reverberating with the creature's silent scream. "The Caldwells?" he managed to ask as Reed helped him to his feet. "Already improving," Reed replied, pointing to where the family lay on the snow, their unnatural pallor fading as sunlight bathed their skin. "They're waking up." Indeed, the 2 older children were already stirring, their eyes blinking open in confusion. The parents and younger children remained unconscious but showed signs of returning awareness, switching fingers, changing breathing patterns. Thomas turned back toward the cave entrance, where smoke now poured from the narrow fissure. "Is it dead?" Reed shook his head grimly. "I don't think something like that can not permanently. But it's hurt, driven back. It may be decades before it recovers enough to hunt again." Thomas nodded, accepting this as the best outcome they could hope for. "We need to seal this entrance. Collapse it completely." "Already sent for dynamite from the mine," Reed assured him. "By nightfall, no one will be able to enter this way again." As they prepared to transport the Caldwells back to town, Thomas found himself looking at the family with complex emotions. They had been taken, changed in ways not yet fully apparent, kept in suspension for months. What memories would they retain? What effects might linger from their captivity? These were questions that only time could answer. Henry Caldwell was the first adult to regain consciousness, his eyes wild with confusion and fear. The tall man, he whispered hoarsely when he saw Thomas. He came for the children first. We tried to fight, but it's over now, Thomas assured him, helping the man sit up. You're safe. Henry's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced, his gaze repeatedly drawn back to the smoking cave entrance. It collects, he murmured. Has always collected. Will always collect. Thomas chose not to argue, knowing that what they had encountered defied rational explanation or easy resolution. Instead, he focused on the practical matters at hand, getting the survivors to safety, ensuring the cave entrance was thoroughly sealed, documenting everything they had witnessed for future reference. As they made their slow way back toward Black Creek, the winter sun beginning its early descent toward the horizon, Thomas found himself contemplating the vast wilderness surrounding them. How many other ancient entities might inhabit these remote places, operating according to patterns and purposes beyond human understanding? How thin was the veneer of civilization that separated mankind from forces it had never fully comprehended? The Caldwell mystery had been solved after a fashion, but Thomas knew he would carry new questions with him for the remainder of his days, questions that would whisper to him in the dark of night, much like the tall, faceless entity had whispered to children from just beyond the firelight's reach. What will you do now? Reed asked as they crested a ridge overlooking the town. Thomas considered the question carefully, feeling the weight of the porcelain doll still in his pocket, a reminder of innocence nearly lost to darkness. Document everything, he replied finally. Add our experience to Wilson's research. Ensure the knowledge isn't lost. And then, Reed pressed. Thomas gazed at the distant horizon where other mountains, other forests, other remote settlements existed. There are more families to protect, he said simply. More mysteries to solve. The dying sunlight caught the smoke still rising from the sealed cave. A dark column against the reddening sky. A temporary victory in a conflict as old as humanity's first ventures into the unknown wilderness. Thomas knew with bone-deep certainty that the entity or others like it would emerge again elsewhere, resuming the ancient pattern of watching, waiting, and collecting. But next time, perhaps, someone would recognize the signs before it was too late. Knowledge was the most powerful weapon they possessed against the darkness that dwelled in the spaces between human settlements, the darkness that had always been there, watching with eyeless patience. For now, though, the Caldwells were returned to the world of light and humanity, a family rescued from a collector of souls that had operated unchecked for generations. It was enough, Thomas decided as Black Creek came fully into view. For today, at least, it was enough.